When you think of World War II, what's the first name that pops into your head? It's Adolf Hitler, right? His rise, his aggression. The whole story for decades has been framed as Hitler's war. But what if that's not the whole picture? What if it's only half the story? All right, so let's get into it. There's this book by Sean McMeekin called Stalin's War, and it throws out this really provocative idea. It asks, what if Joseph Stalin wasn't just a side player reacting to Hitler? What if he was actually one of the main instigators, pulling the strings from the very start, all for his own imperial ambitions? So you've got these two competing perspectives. On one hand, there's the story we all know. The war was a clear-cut, necessary fight against the Nazis. Simple enough. But then McMeekin's book comes in with this radical counter-narrative. It says, hold on a second. This was also Stalin's war, a war he didn't just stumble into, but one he actively helped start and then twisted to his own advantage to build a massive communist empire. Okay, so to really get what McMeekin is arguing here, we've got to go back, way back, long before 1939. See, Soviet foreign policy wasn't just about reacting to events as they happened. No, it was all based on a very specific, very patient, long-term game plan. And get this wasn't some top-secret plan buried in an archive. Vladimir Lenin said it right out in the open. The whole strategy was to basically poke and prod the big capitalist powers, Germany, Britain, France, and get them to go at each other's throats. The goal? Let them completely exhaust themselves in a massive war. And then, once the dust settled, the communists could just waltz in and pick up the pieces. Fast forward just a few years, and who do you see following that exact same playbook? Joseph Stalin. For him, a big war in Europe wasn't something to be scared of. No, it was the golden opportunity. The plan was pretty simple, really. Just sit back, let the so-called imperialists tear each other apart, and then, right at the last second, jump in and tip the scales for good. And look, this wasn't just theory. In 1939, Stalin put the plan into action. He signs that infamous pact with Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which behind closed doors carved up Eastern Europe between them. That deal basically gave Hitler the green light to invade Poland. And sure enough, just a few weeks later, Stalin's troops roll in to grab their piece of the pie, before setting their sights on Finland. This right here just drives the point home. According to McMeekin, the whole idea of splitting up Poland, it wasn't even Hitler's to begin with. It was Stalin who'd been dangling that carrot a year earlier, trying to lure Germany into a deal. And when the invasion finally went down, guess what? Stalin's share of the country was even bigger than Germany's. Okay, now this quote, this is a big one. It's from a secret speech Stalin gave to military graduates just weeks before Hitler invaded. You could call it a smoking gun, because while he was talking about peace in public, behind the scenes he was telling his top commanders, all right, defense is over, it's time to go on offense. He was ready to expand the socialist world by force. But then, everything went sideways for Stalin. His whole master plan hit a massive, catastrophic wall. In June 1941, Hitler double-crossed him. Operation Barbarossa begins, and the German invasion of the Soviet Union is so fast, so brutal, it almost completely obliterates the Red Army. Stalin's whole project was on the verge of collapse. And the initial collapse was just unbelievable. See, Stalin had his armies all geared up for an attack, not a defense. They were packed right up against the new borders, totally exposed. So when the Germans hit, the Soviet lines were just incredibly brittle. They shattered, and the Wehrmacht just tore right through. It's honestly hard to even wrap your head around the scale of this disaster. Look at that number, 20,500. That's how many tanks the Red Army lost in under 6 months. We're talking about almost 80% of his entire armored force just gone. The massive war machine Stalin had spent a decade building was literally on the brink of being wiped out. And right there, in that moment of total desperation, you get one of the greatest ironies in history. The survival of world communism now depended entirely on the generosity of its number one sworn enemy, Anglo-Saxon capitalism. And boy, was it a lifeline. Through the Lend-Lease program, the amount of aid the West sent was just staggering. We're not just talking about guns and planes. We're talking about the stuff that actually makes an army run. Trucks, jeeps, locomotives, food, industrial gear. They even shipped over entire factories. Roosevelt basically handed Stalin a blank check and asked for nothing in return. So as all this aid starts pouring in and helps turn the tide, the story takes another turn. Stalin starts to think about the endgame, and he starts ruthlessly pushing his own post-war agenda, even if it meant betraying the very allies who were literally saving his skin. And there's no better or more tragic example of this than what happened in Warsaw in the summer of 1944. The Red Army is right on the doorstep of the city. So the Polish resistance, thinking this is it, rises up to fight the German occupiers. They're expecting, any minute now, for the Soviets to come in and help. So the main group fighting in Warsaw was the Polish Home Army, the AK. Now, it's super important to know, these guys weren't communists. They were patriots, loyal to the free Polish government that was in exile in London. And for Stalin, well, that made them a huge problem. He didn't see them as allies to be rescued. He saw them as a political rival that stood in the way of his plan to install a communist puppet government in Poland. So what does Stalin do? It's just chillin'. He orders the Red Army to stop dead in its tracks, right on the other side of the river, just outside Warsaw. And for 63 days, he just sits and watches while the Nazis systematically crush the uprising, level the city, and kill hundreds of thousands of people. He even refused to let Allied planes land on his airfields to drop supplies for the fighters. And at the same time, his own secret police were rounding up any Polish resistance fighters they could find and shipping them off to the gulags. He basically let the Nazis do his dirty work for him. All right, so let's jump to the end. The war is over, the dust has settled in 1945. And you have to ask the big question, who really won? Because if you look at the final scorecard, McMeekin's book argues there's one undisputed champion. By the time it was all over, Stalin had pretty much gotten everything he wanted. He was now the master of a massive new empire, one that stretched all the way from central Germany out to the Pacific Ocean. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, all of Eastern Europe was now under his thumb. And he'd perfectly set the stage for communist victories in Asia, too. And the man's opportunism was just off the charts. He'd promised his allies for years that he'd help fight Japan. But he waited and waited until the absolute last possible second. Literally, after the second atomic bomb was dropped, just 3 days before Japan's final surrender, he launches this massive invasion of Manchuria. He grabs a ton of territory, captures a bunch of industrial equipment, and then just hands it all over to Mao's communists. That move pretty much guaranteed they would win the Chinese Civil War. And this chart really just says it all, doesn't it? It's the whole book in one simple visual. The Axis powers, completely defeated. The old empires like Britain and France, basically bankrupt and broken. And the Soviet Union, armed to the teeth by its capitalist enemies, it rises from the ashes as a genuine global superpower. And that brings us to the core, chilling argument of Stalin's war. In the frantic rush to destroy one totalitarian regime, the West ended up propping up and fueling the rise of another. All that unconditional aid to Stalin didn't lead to a peaceful, democratic world. Instead, it created another monster, an expansionist empire that would plunge the world right into the next 50 years' struggle, the Cold War. So that's where we're left, with this really unsettling question. We always call it the good war, right? But when you look at it from this angle, you just have to ask, if World War II was a victory, whose victory was it, really? And what, in the end, was the true cost?